Welcome to the Belfry Hockey Podcast. My name is Daryl Belfry, and we are in Season 3, and this is going to be episode 12. And what I want to talk about this episode is the impact of storytelling in player development. Now, just to take a step back before I get started on storytelling and where that kind of came from, what what's happened to me over the last, I would say, 10 years or so is I've done three major studies that are outside of hockey that have had a profound impact on the way in which I operate. The first study that I did was on interviewers. So this would be like Howard Stern, Oprah Winfrey, Diane Sawyer, those types of interviewers. And I would go through, I mean, there's no shortage of them on YouTube. And I did some reading of some books on it. And then I just got in the habit of just watching interview after interview after interview to try to see just how in which people are able to communicate with others and be able to create a dialogue. Because an interview is really like a more formal, but it's a staged conversation in which you're trying to elicit information from the other person, and you then take that information and carry on the conversation with someone else. That's essentially what it is. So when you think about building a relationship with a player and you're trying to communicate with that player, and in my world, I only have a very short period of time with the player face to face when we're right on the ice. Like, I don't really have a lot of time to get it wrong. And so wanted to just really understand like the succinct nature of being able to elicit the information that I needed to then be able to figure out what I wanted to do next, or how I was going to use that information to be able to then you know keep the session moving and continue putting forth my best effort to create a development impact. Now, if any of you have kids, you would know, like, if you've ever ask a kid, like your own kid, when they get in the car, driving them home, which I've done, like most of our life with our kids, and you ask them everybody's favorite question, which was, "How was your school day today?" You will always get, and I don't know, maybe my kids are different than everyone else's, but my kids will always be like, "Yeah, it was good." And that's it, like no context, no nothing. Like, then you have to kind of ask follow-up questions, but you got to be careful because you can't be like 20 questions. Like, it's a real challenge. And then ultimately, if you're able to unlock it and figure out like how to get them to open up, all of a sudden you realize like their whole world changed in that day. Like, there was a lot of things that happened, but just the combination of getting in the car after school, they don't want to really rehash it. They just want to kind of decompress a little bit, but you're so excited to see them, you want to get this information from them. So for me, the whole idea that's surrounding like asking questions, and this has become like a real thing in hockey coaching and hockey development, is, well, just ask, you got to ask questions. And I think it's way more than that. And that's why I went down this whole rabbit hole of interviewing, because there's a lot of different ways in which you can ask a question. And I wanted to get to become a lot more skilled in the art of asking a question. So it's not just a, "Hey, how was your school day today?" Sometimes you can just start a conversation, you just create a little dialogue, and then you can ask a question without really asking a question. You make a few statements, and then you stop, and then the impression is that the other person will then pick up from there. It's not really a question. You're just making a few statements, stringing them together, and then the fact that you stop, now it invites the person to then contribute to the conversation. So that was a big one that I spent a lot of time in. The second one was stand-up comedy. Stand-up comedy is probably, if it's the hardest job for sure. It's so difficult, the ability to just make people laugh. Like, you have a certain audience, you don't know like every audience is going to be different. Just even in the raw data of how many females to males who are actually in attendance. Then you have all the age gap. Then you have the diversity and backgrounds, and you have all this all compiled into one, and then you get someone on stage who's able to make everyone in the building laugh. They can connect with them with some type of way in which they're able to articulate their joke that that becomes relatable or funny to every person in the room, regardless of sex, race, background, age. All that stuff gets all thrown out the window, and they're able to connect people. To be able to do that is obviously incredibly difficult. And so I went down a whole path of how they construct jokes and where it comes from. And there's a lot of, again, if you really want to know, and you get in this rabbit hole like I did, there's no shortage of whether it's YouTube videos of whether it's Seinfeld articulating his joke telling process. And you get into not only him, but then there was a guy, Ralphie May, which is he had an hour long podcast where he essentially broke down his entire way in which he breaks down, like, was building jokes. And there was a lot of reference of how he had other influences and how they had helped shape him to build out these jokes. And then there's no way you can go down that whole path without then talking about Dave Chappelle, who's, in my mind, might be the best that's ever done it. And you start listening to him. He has a whole thing on Joe Rogan that he talks about his joke telling process and how it all come about and what his process is. And then you listen to that, and then listen to like a Netflix special, and you start like putting it together of how he does things, and it just gives you a bit of an insight into the art that goes beyond just laughing at someone's joke. So that was another one. Just the truest form of like real communication and connecting with people. That was another thing that I really wanted to know. And then the last one was storytelling. Storytelling, I kind of fell into it a little bit because I had read a lot about storytelling as it relates to a team. And there was a lot of really good information on a few different teams about how they were able to create a narrative or a story about their team. Like one of the easiest one is like everyone's against us. So that's like it's us against the world type of narrative. And you listen when you hear that, and you start hearing the coaches' interviews, and then you listen to the coaches' interview while they're at like the Final Four in basketball. And then you trace it back to listen to their interviews from earlier in the season. You start to see how this whole thing started to build for them over the course of the year, and it became an underlying story that they then bought into as a group. Not bought into, it's the wrong way to say it, which that would be that you're selling the story. It's not that you're selling the story so much as like they just become it. They become the story. And that's incredibly powerful in terms of like pulling people together, is the art of storytelling. So from there, I got into songwriting. And I wanted to really, so first, storytelling, the whole art of being able to put together a story and all the different pieces that go into that. Then you get into a little bit of screenwriting and how that works. I did a whole thing on Sylvester Stallone and how he had built out the whole Rocky series. Then one of the really interesting resources is Matt Damon. There's a ton of Matt Damon, small bites of him in interviews, really putting together an interesting dialogue surrounding the art of storytelling and what really stood out to him in his movie career, and how him and Ben Affleck were able to do the whole Goodwill Hunting and how some of those pieces came together. So that I got to be really fascinated with that. Then I got into songwriting and the real true like songwriting people who are really the best in the business. So like the conversation really starts right now with Taylor Swift and the way that she is able to stitch stories together and be able to have that as a major part of the way in which she approaches her songwriting. So then you start studying like how that goes on and the succinct nature. So the interesting part about songwriting, and you take a look at that in the same way as in joke telling. So you have songwriting and you have writing a joke. So much of it is trimming out and using like a smaller number of words to be able to articulate and paint a picture. So same way you're telling a joke, you're creating a picture, you're setting a scene. Same with storytelling as it relates to songwriting. You're doing the same thing. You're setting a scene, you're telling a story, you're pulling pieces in, but it can't be too wordy. Otherwise, you're going to lose the rhythm and the beat. Or as a joke teller, like they call it like the fat. There can't be any fat in the joke. You're trying to trim that all the time. So when they're trying to loop it, or they call them tiebacks. They have a joke that they start, and then that central part of that first part of the joke, as they go through their set, they'll tie back to that joke. But the way in which they do it is very succinct. And so this is all really speaks to me because these are art forms of communication that are critical in my world, because I have a very short amount of time in front of this athlete and I have to be able to speak clearly and I have to be able to articulate exactly what I want. I have to be able to set a scene. One of the things with the NHL, like working with NHL players, it's probably, in my mind, it's a little different than working with younger players. When you're working with younger players, it's less about the situations that occur. You're trying to kind of draw some relationships between like common events that are going to occur, or frequent events that are going to occur, and how they can apply their skill set into that. So you're really trying to draw awareness to the multiplicity of utility of the skills in which you're using. Oh, you might be able to use it here. Oh, what about this? Any ideas that you might have? Yeah, I think about this. Okay, great. Let's put all that in. Now, so there's a bit of an awakening of like, wow, this is a high utility skill. Yeah, I could use this a lot of places. So it's that. In the NHL, everything is situational. The entire game is based on recurring like situations that happen and the application of skill that occurs, and really an imposition of will into the situation. So if you took a look at that and you said, okay, well, what's that relationship to storytelling? Well, you have a situation, and in my mind, that's a scene. So how that you have actors and pieces that are going to contribute to this scene. You have kind of a precursor of how they got into this scene, and then you have things that are going to happen thereafter. This could be a major part of the scene. This scene, it could be a major part of the movie or the story that you will then, it'll act a little bit as foreshadowing for what might happen later, or the recurring nature of how it goes. So in my mind, there was a lot of these pieces that really started to kind of come together. And when I thought about it also from the work I had done previously on vocabulary and really learning the value of like how vocabulary is taught in school and the parallels of vocabulary as it relates to the development of hockey is frighteningly similar. And so the whole idea of the fluency of reading and the fact that you can't just learn one skill, you can't learn each individual skill by itself on its own. You'll never learn, you'll learn so few number of skills. the same with vocabulary. You can't just go to a dictionary and just start, learning words, and you'll never learn all the words. The best way is to learn a few words, be able to understand its context, and then it's the reading. You start reading, and in our case, you play games, and in the games, these skills start to highlight and pop out, and then the games, you start to make some relationships, or you start to draw and infer meaning inside of what you're either reading or the way in which you're playing. So the whole idea of the way vocabulary is taught and the way that our game is played and how it's taught and how you can try to teach one thing, but the way in which you create multiple instances of interaction in that one thing creates an understanding that is so much deeper than that they're able to then perform at a really high level because they understand that and that transferability of that in the context of the way the game is played, that will really highlight their ability to be able to then impose their will on the game, which is what I'm trying to get to as it relates to storytelling. So in hockey, especially at the NHL level, the whole idea is the ability to impose your will on the game. That's really the number one thing. You have a certain skill set. You have a circumstance, meaning the way in which your situation, so the team that you're playing on, the players you're playing with, the team you're playing against, the players you're playing against, the circumstances surrounding your shift, whether it's even where both two lines came out even, both fresh played, or I'm going on while you have already played 30 seconds. So there's a bit of a physical advantage that I'm having in terms of energy expenditure, or I'm on the backside of that. Like you're coming on while I was already on, and now I'm at the back half of my shift, and now you're coming on. So all these like circumstances and situations, the score of the game, where you are in the season. There's so many different the period that you're in, the time on the clock. All those things matter, and they factor into the decision making that is what we see in the NHL. Like, for example, one of the other pieces that's really important to understand is like in the playoffs, you get a young team, like team gets beat in the first round, like call it like Tampa a few years ago, right? They get swept by Columbus, and then the next year they go win the Stanley Cup. And say, well, you know what? Like they needed to learn lessons. So what lessons are you learning? Well, what you're learning in large part is the situational nature of the game. There's just certain times of a game. There's certain moments of a game. The game has to be played a certain way. And you have to adapt to that. You can't just play. You don't just play it honestly like you would normally. It has certain circumstances that surround it, which causes you to make decisions in how you're going to impose your skill. Sometimes it's better just to tie the shift. Like you're not trying to win the shift. You're just going to push the shift forward so that the game continues on. Sometimes that's an opportunity to absolutely go in and impose your will and try to win the shift. So it's learning that there's certain times in a game where you should be looking to impose, and then there's certain times in a game in which this is not that time to push the envelope. This is a time for to play it differently. And so that's part of understanding how to talk to an NHL player. Is they're so focused on obviously skill acquisition. They want to know that. They want to know the situations in which this is going to happen, the frequency of the event, how often they're in that situation, like what kind of utility does this actually have in my own game, and what potential impact could it have on other aspects. So this is all part of the story. Plus, you have how well do you know this player? Do you know what their actual identity is, who they are, the skill sets that they have, all that sort of thing. All these things matter in how then you're going to communicate to this player. So that's why in my mind, when I first started with storytelling, I was working with players and I had developed what I called a success equation. So what the success equation was I would watch a player play, like, say, 5 games. This is like a new client. So a new client comes out, I'd watch them play 5 games, and I would build out my argument as to, okay, I've watched you play 5 games. This is what I think you're good at. These are areas that I think you could improve. And then this is the pathway that I think you can do it. And the success equation was the pathway of influence. If you improve these areas in this, and this is, you take this approach and you influence this skill, which would then have a positive impact on this skill, which would then be able to transfer into this area of the ice and this area of the ice. Now we have both of these two impacts. The moral of the story is you're going to get the puck more, or you're going to be able to make more plays, or you're going to be in better position. Whatever the desired outcome is, I'm able to paint a picture of development which justifies why we're doing what we're doing. So when I then say, okay, well, this is something where we're going to try to improve your skating, and now we're going to do some specific work as it relates to balance or edge control, and it's kind of a little bit, can get a little bit juvenile in the sense of, like, we're not exactly like doing crazy stuff. We're really in the fabric of fundamental. The player now understands that this is the path that we're taking, and this is a part of building the foundation for what's to come. And that's how I started with storytelling. But I didn't really equate it to storytelling at the time. I just thought I called it this success equation. This is how I'm going to move you forward over the course of the time in which I have you, and at the end, this will be the desired result. And this is what I'm expecting to transfer and how it's going to transfer. That's what I was trying to communicate. Once I started to understand storytelling, I thought what the impact of that was that I was able to articulate the success equation in a way that was much more had much more of an emotional investment in it. And so what I mean by that was I related it to their best strengths, or to where their greatest areas of opportunity were, and I was able to articulate it with much more of a tone or a way of speaking that really drew that connection. And that's what I wanted to do, was elicit a response. And what I've learned in my understanding of these disciplines, what started with vocabulary years ago, and then you move through whether it be the comedy, you move through storytelling, you move through interviewing. These are all areas like figuring out how to communicate things differently or better. One of the things that what I really started to grab me was the real art of communication is eliciting that physical response. So the best storytelling is one that creates an impact on the person, where they can feel, whether it be empathy towards who you're talking about, or whether it's they feel a sense of sadness, or they feel really happy, or they're excited. And in hockey terms, it's like the player knows that they can feel like this is truly the next step for them, and they can feel it as they are moving. So the story matches the movement, and the movement matches the desired result, and then there's an excitement that comes from that. It's a physical response. Our game, hockey, is a sport, and sport is expressed physically. Even though there's a lot of mental and emotional and stuff, it's expressed through the physical movement. So whatever it is that you're trying to influence, whether it's the way someone thinks, or whether it's the way someone thinks about themselves, or what their background knowledge towards the game, the goal is not to have it read out like a textbook. It's to have it create a response, like an energy. a feeling that is expressed through the physical movement. That's what the value of storytelling and learning how storytelling works, that's what it impacted had on me. And ever since that, I've stopped like I've stopped trying to think about it in a way where I'm like trying to present my case. Like at first when I was doing the success equations, I was like, I've done my homework. I'm going to sit down. I've laid this all out. Now I'm going to state my case. I like to state my case better than selling. I was always adverse, and you've heard me talk about this all the time. I really don't like the references of selling something to a player. I just don't like the whole narrative. I don't like the inferences that come from that. I don't want I don't ever want to be associated with that I was a salesman in selling what it was that I was doing. I don't want that. So I wanted to distance myself always from that. And it was just like this, I just didn't like it. And I wanted to move into this other. So I left the whole idea of selling. And then every time you hear it, well, we're selling or players are buying in or this or that, I don't like it. And you'll hear me sometimes mention it. And then I'll right away try to switch that because that's an immediate switch for me. I don't want to have any inferences that that's what I'm doing because I think that there's a better way to communicate the game. So that's where I went to this whole stating my case. And, I had my argument and I was going to present my argument to the player. And then the player would see that I have all the evidence that this is a worthwhile venture for that player to engage in, and that the benefits at the end of it would be worthwhile to really see through. And the arguments make perfect sense, they're logical, and the player's on board, they're ready to go. So that was where I was. And then once I started to really start to understand the storytelling piece, then it became, if I'm not selling, I'm certainly not building an argument anymore. What I'm doing is I'm painting a picture in your mind through the storytelling of the way you play and how you can then impose that will in your game on a consistent basis. And I'm going to be able to use the story of the game in the way you play it to be able to articulate the benefits of adding this little change of mentality, like a little paradigm shift of your approach in a specific area of the ice that could lead to a whole other set of skills that maybe would unlock an area that you haven't done before. An entire building of new skill sets in a specific area to be able to maybe just get shots through. Like you're in this area all the time. You shoot from this spot all the time. The high majority of the shots are getting blocked. Like the result is what the result is. So now let's talk about a story of how we can get into that spot. This is the world that you're in. You can impose the game till you get to this moment. Once you get here, now we need to change the results. And here's how we're going to do it. And I found that, coming across from that to where it creates that emotional response or connectedness to the skill, it greatly influences the results that we have with the player. And I think that that's been a major breakthrough of mine. And I don't think that the order in which I went through these studies is has had a negative impact. In other words, I think it's no accident that I did it in this order, and it wasn't anything of mine. I just kind of stumbled on it one after the other, but it's the natural or logical next question that came up, and it led me down a path and then ultimately got to storytelling. But when you really look at joke telling and stand-up comedy, you really talk about interviewing, like the really top-end interviewers. And then you really look at storytelling, whether it's through songwriting or through coming up with a way in which you're gonna, whether it's screenplay writing or even writing a book. All those things are an ability to communicate to somebody to create a response, a physical response to what's being said, whether it's laughter, someone, Oprah Winfrey, or not Oprah Winfrey, but like Barbara Walters is on the other side. People would say, they'd sit down for like 2 minutes and they would say, "Oh my God, I told myself not to cry. And here I am 2 minutes into this interview and I'm already crying with Barbara." Well, she just had a way about her, in the way in which she structured, the way in which she communicated, her tone of her voice, the use of the way in which she painted the picture of the question. All of that led to pulling this emotion. And we have players in our game, and every player that I have that I've worked with in the NHL, they have a tremendous feel. Like, that's what makes them so good. Their learning all comes from their ability to take something they see or something they hear and express that through physical movement. And that's a conversion process. And now here you are, telling a story. You're creating a level of emotion towards it that builds it forward, so that now the player is so comfortable with where you're going because they have now a connection to what it is that you're talking about. And for me, I'm nowhere near where I want to be in all of this. I'm only like probably 10 years into this study, and I still am working on it. I'm still looking up interviews, and I'm still looking up, I watch as many different kinds of comedy as I can with different types of people who are trying to connect or tell jokes in a certain like type of genre. We have Chappelle, which gets into like a lot more like the political stuff, and then you have other people like Sebastian, who is like he's relating everything to where he's like there's an emotional connection to where like he's expressing his family and the differences between the way he grew up and the way his wife is, and now they've connected because they're from two different worlds, and now they've connected, and he's able to highlight that, which a lot of people can connect with. So there's different genres of the way in which the different storytelling, and whether you're talking about building like you're writing a book and it's a romantic comedy, or you're writing a book and it's like a courtroom drama, or it's a horror movie, or it's a suspense thriller, or whatever. There's all different types of emotions that you're trying to pull from people, or you're Taylor Swift and you're trying to connect with people in your music, and the way in which you tell the story, and the way the words you use, the tone, the type of music, the way that the arrangement comes together with the words, it produces and elicits a response. People get connected to the music. That's what it's about. So for me, when I'm talking to my players, when I'm talking about player development and particularly their player development, I want them to connect to the emotion of the benefit of where we're trying to go, and the better I'm able to articulate that for where they're trying to go with their game, and the excitement level that I have towards what the impact will be, and then I lay out the success equation. I just am able to do it now in a way that the player can connect to, which leads to greater results. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. It's about transfer. I need the player to be able to do it in a game. And there's there's nothing really like it when you have a player who's able to take something that was an idea, you foster that idea into a story, you build out the story, the player is then able to go through this success equation of how you're going to build it and the steps that you take and the order in which you present it. The player gets a handle on it, and then they're able to then express it their own way. They put their own stamp on it, They have their own ideas contributed to it. Now it becomes a we thing. All of a sudden now they go in a game and they do it, and that goal that they score or that play that they make, it contributes to winning. And when you see it from that perspective, that instance, that goal that was scored, it impacts the game. It changes the outcome. When to be a part of that, there's just nothing like it. To just see it happen and then be able to draw a direct relationship to the work that you've done. I mean, come on. There's nothing like that. And that's what I'm in it for. And so when I go down these paths that have nothing to do with hockey, but yet everything to do with my work, it's some of the most rewarding work I've ever done. And the order of I got hooked on the start, which was from my friend Bill Gilmeister, who did he put me in a frame of mind to study vocabulary, and he saw a direct relationship between it. And then he sent me these links to books, and I bought the books and read them, and I was like, wow. And then at some point I just replaced the word replaced the word with puck or play, and then just read the sentence, and it was like, oh my god, this is crazy. And then I could do like a whole rewrite the paragraph that was written for teaching kids vocabulary and rewrite it using hockey terms, and it come out like, and it was crazy. The parallel was exact. So once you see that, you can't unsee it. So now you're looking for these other different types of parallels, and these other three things that I've gone through and continue to go through have led me to have some of the greatest impact in my own personal development.